Good evening, students. Welcome to Swayam Shikshaa. I could not do videos last 1 week because of bad health. So I'm back again. And today's theme is inflation. And inflation is one such topic where if we can spend some 20-25 minutes, any question on inflation, I can tell you seriously, any question on inflation, even if it is from economic survey, it can be handled. So the efficiency part is very high when it comes to this topic called inflation. So what are the areas where questions can come? Okay, so first of all, before showing you the previous questions, first of all, one is what is this inflation? Okay, inflation is nothing but price rise, as we all know. So it is basically a rate. It is basically a rate. Okay, and in the recent past, there was a challenge of inflation globally, and that is the reason the central banks in US, even across the globe in Europe and even India, went ahead with something called as the monetary tightening. India, basically, if you observe in the last 1 year, it has increased the repo rates by almost 250 basis points. That is, the repo rate was increased from 4 to 6.5. This is a clear understanding that there is a monetary tightening that is happening. And because of this monetary tightening, even that is interest rates in India are increasing. All this is done basically to counter inflation. Now the question comes up, is it that this monetary tightening only done by India, or is it that the monetary tightening has been done across the globe? For example, now in US there was federal tightening that was done even in the recent past. Last week there was federal tightening, and because of which there's every chance that the bond interest rates in US are going to increase. And when bond interest rates in US are going to increase, automatically there can be flight of capital that can happen from countries like India, where people may think that the bonds in US are giving better return and they can move from India to US. And because of this flight of capital, the supply of dollars in India will come down and dollar starts becoming costly, and because of that the rupee value is going to depreciate. And this depreciation of rupee value can again make our imports costly. And if these imports are going to become costly, our oil will become costly, our food will become costly, fertilizers, etc. These things start becoming costly and again driving inflation. Now, the economic survey also says, in comparison to other countries, India is okay because our inflation is at bearable limits. For example, our bearable inflation range is 4 plus or minus 2. That is basically the upper limit of 6% when we talk about CPI combined. When we talk about CPI combined, the upper limit is 6. So a percentage of 7 or 7.5 is something controllable for India. That is, it is 1% higher than the bearable inflation. But when it comes to US, the situation can be a little different. Suppose US controllable inflation is only 5, but US inflation last year, because of several factors, also has touched 9.2. UK has touched 9.2, 9.3. Countries like Turkey have touched 80% inflation. This is a clear indication that globally inflation has increased. Now, what were the reasons? One is during lockdown scenario, government started giving a lot of money to public. You can call it as one fiscal stimulus on one side and monetary stimulus on the other side. People started holding money, but people did not spend that money because of uncertainty, lockdowns, COVID. They did not spend money. So because of which, after the first wave, in fact, when we talk about the pent up demand, so when I use this word pent up demand is linked to inflation. See, pent up demand is that demand which increases after a slump, when there is a downfall with respect to demand, and if it is increasing after that, we use the word pent up demand. So this pent up demand started increasing when lockdown restrictions have been removed. When lockdown restrictions have been removed, and then people started coming and spending that excess money which was given by government or RBI, whatever it is. And because of this, money supply increased, inflation increased. Along with this, Russia-Ukraine war brought in supply constraints. Oil started becoming costly. food started becoming costly. And because of this, overall, inflation rates, not just India, but across the globe, have increased. Now, this is one clear understanding which we have to have. Now, where questions can come? Question can come in the context of the economic survey talking about what has happened to the CPI and WPI inflation. Okay, so CPI, WPI inflation. To understand CPI and WPI inflation, we should first understand the weightages and how it is calculated. For when we talk about the wholesale price index, that means we are calculating inflation at the wholesale level. Maybe a mandi, a market, agriculture mandi is an example of a wholesale market. Mainly it is useful for the manufacturers. Now, what is that we have to understand about the WPI? So here, if you see this box here, I have written something. Here, there are some components. So how is inflation measured, first of all? I am taking a basket. In this basket, I'm putting some goods, and these goods, let's say I'm putting some 697 items in this basket. Now, these 697 items, I'm measuring the price of this basket in 2011-12, which is the base year for WPI. And again, I will measure the price of this basket again back in 2022-23. And if in 2022-23, if if it is, let's say, 108 rupees, 108, then I will call it as 8% inflation. That is a simple logic. Now, is it that all the items in the basket are given similar price or similar weightage? No. Based on the importance of the item, okay, the weightage will differ for each and every entity. First thing what we should understand is this basket which I'm talking about, this basket has mainly three components: the primary articles, the fuel and power, as well as the manufactured products. If you see our slide there, which is visible on the screen, you have three articles: primary, fuel. So first observation, in WPI basket, maximum weightage is given to manufacturing, which is around 64.2%. So manufacturing related aspects, if they are becoming costly, import of iron, import of raw materials, steel, if it is becoming costly, WPI inflation will get affected more than the CPI inflation because the weightage of manufacturing is at a higher level. So this is one understanding, very important understanding. And one more important understanding is, now WPI inflation, we have manufacturing aspects given something like 64.2, and WPI inflation can also be seen as imported inflation. Imported by, because imported raw material or supply constraints making imports costly will have a higher impact on my WPI inflation. Another important observation and understanding here is something like, across the globe, if inflation is increasing by 1%, according to RBI, across the globe, if inflation is increasing, WPI inflation is increasing by 1%. In India, WPI inflation will increase at a rate of 1.63 straight. Now, this is the RBI's logic, which it has mentioned in the economic survey. Very important. That means imported inflation, weightage of manufacturing is more. And the food weightage, observe the food weightage. The food weightage is there in the primary part. In the primary articles, there are food items, and even in the manufactured food. So this is manufactured food, can be processed foods. Both weights, if I put together, 15.3 plus 9.1, we have 24.4%. So WPI food is around 24.4, but in the CPI, food is around 45.9. Food plus beverages put together is 45.9, and CPI food is around 39%. So this is one observation. Food is the major component in CPI index. Now here one more observation is, when I use the word core inflation, very important. Core inflation is something like when I'm excluding the volatile aspects which move, the way the inflation changes on a continuous basis, like oil, like food. Okay, so when I'm removing this oil and food inflations, which are very much vulnerable to daily shocks from the total inflation, from the headline is the total inflation. From that, if I'm removing this food and food and oil, which is vulnerable, then we arrive at WPI core. If WPI core is stable, RBI says don't worry. For example, here, WPI core weightage here, if this 55.1, in WPI, the core weightage is around 55.1. Now, if WPI core is okay, then RBI says it's okay. You can relax a little, in the sense that your core inflation is stable, so you need not worry much. Okay, but if the core inflation is also fluctuating, it's a bigger problem, because the volatile aspects, if you're removing and still there is inflation. Okay, so that is what is WPI core. So UPSC can ask the difference between core and headline. Headline is the total inflation. So here you can see the weightage of headline 100%. Food weightage in WPI is 24.4. Maximum weightage is given to manufacturing 64.2. Base year for WPI is 2011-12, and WPI core we have 55.1. That's more than sufficient to understand WPI. Any question with respect to WPI can be handled from this chart. Now, if I have to make an observation and a comparison between CPI and WPI. Now, if this is the CPI basket, CPI is also a basket now. We are taking a basket of goods and services. So here in WPI, it is only goods. There will not be any services in WPI. But in CPI combined, so the CPI combined is what? CPI rural plus CPI urban. You have both goods as well as services. That means if services cost like housing is increasing, then it will have an impact on CPI, but it will not have an impact. Services cost will not have an impact on WPI index. This is one more observation they can ask, because in CPI there is services, and one of the important services in CPI urban is housing. So in the recent past, RBI's observation, not only RBI but even the CSO or the NSO here, is in the urban areas the housing rates were increasing, that is inflation is increasing, because of what? Because of which the CPI inflation started increasing. So here comparison of weightages. Now food and beverages in CPI we have given 45.86. If I have to take only food, it is around 39.1. Beverages included, it is 45.86. Now, what is the learning here? Why is it that food has been given more weightage? In CPI, out of my total income, the proportion of the total income which we spend, the consumer is spending. If you're spending more percentage of your income on a particular aspect, that will be given higher weightage. Suppose consumers are spending maximum chunk. It is not about total income. It is proportion of their income. Suppose my income is 100. I'm spending 50 rupees on food. That means 50% of my income I'm spending on food. That means in the CPI index, per capita consumption expenditure on food is more. So therefore, the weightage for food and beverages, you find 45.86. Very important understanding. So food inflation has a direct impact on the CPI inflation because the weightage is higher. So in WPI, the food inflation was lower than the CPI. This is one more observation. In WPI, services are not there. And in CPI, we have both goods as well as services. This is one more understanding there. Now here, economic survey also gives some indications. What are the things? Economic survey says food and beverages, cereals were becoming costly because of shortages. Milk was becoming costly because of non-availability of animal feed, etc. Vegetables especially becoming costly because of tomatoes, etc. Supply chain constraints, tomatoes getting wasted, etc. This was one more indication. Education services started becoming costly. This is what the economic survey says. Education in the CPI services becoming costly. Why education services? Offline has opened and cost started increasing. Health services price started decreasing in the CPI because during COVID, basically 2020, 21, COVID scenario, health had more demand, but later on health demand reduced and therefore health inflation was okay. Now here when I say core in CPI also, when I say CPI core means I have to remove fuel and light and I have to remove food and beverages. So when I say CPI core is nothing but 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 6. This miscellaneous is also services, nothing but services. Miscellaneous is nothing but services, remember. Okay, so when I say CPI core, it is these 2, 3, 4 and 6 which are visible on the slide. When I say CPI headline, everything for policy making, it's everything 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, but in the last year economic survey, they have used a word called CPI refined core. Now, what is refined core? Refined core means you're removing food and fuel. Along with that, fuel can also have impact on transportation. So transportation is also part of the miscellaneous services. If I remove that also, then it is nothing but CPI refined core. So CPI core, CPI headline, CPI refined core. These are the terms. And what is the base year for CPI calculation, CPI combined calculation? The base year is 2012. This is one more observation. So base year for WPI is 2011-12. This is more than sufficient. Now, one more important thing which we have to understand from the economic survey is WPI inflation was on a higher side than CPI. Okay, in the 2020-21. And now we observe by December 2022, WPI inflation is coming down because of government's measures. Government has come up with reducing import duties, okay, reducing taxes, reducing import duties, putting up reducing excise duties on petrol, diesel. Along with that, government started putting up stock limits. You can't stock beyond a particular level with respect to essential commodities, etc. Which that means you're preventing hoarding because of government measures also. And across the globe, food inflation reduced because of which WPI started coming down. Now we observe that there is a convergence between CPI and WPI by December 22. Earlier it was high. By November 2021 it was high. But by December 2022, there was convergence of WPI and CPI. This is WPI, this is CPI at the bottom. So there was convergence. Now why? WPI prices, food inflation coming down, but services inflation increasing. So services inflation, especially housing and all, that was the reason for CPI going up, and both started converging. So this is one more important aspect which you'll remember for prelims, this year's prelims. Another important aspect is the comparison between rural and urban inflation. Now again, rural and urban inflation, when I'm talking about CPI, this is the CPI box which is there, which is visible here, and rural and urban have different weightages, and therefore the inflation can have a different impact on rural, different impact on urban because of multiple reasons. First reason is because of the weightages that are assigned. Okay, so here if you observe, in the rural, the food and beverages is given 54.18 in the CPI basket, but in urban it is 36. Overall put together around 45.19. But rural, why? Because in the rural areas, maximum proportion of their income they are spending on food, and therefore around 54% is weightage is given to food. So this is something which we have to understand. In the similar manner, the basket is different. Now in the housing in rural, there is everybody has a house or at least a kacha house, so housing services does not play any role in the CPI rural. But in the CPI urban, if you observe, housing has 21.67 weightage. You can observe this. So this again has an impact. That means if prices are increasing, now this is going to happen. Okay, so then here miscellaneous, we have miscellaneous almost. Fuel is more sensitive in the rural areas. Now, what the survey says is the rural inflation 2022-23. Okay, so during COVID pandemic, urban inflation was more than rural. But by the time of 2022-23, what we observe is rural inflation in most of the states was higher than the urban inflation. This is one. Most of the states we observe that rural inflation. Okay, and reason is food prices across the globe reduced, and in rural areas food prices reduced at a slower pace because of lack of availability of imported food. Imported food was easily available in the urban areas, because of which food prices started decreasing in the urban areas at a faster pace than the rural areas. And what we observe in 2020, by 22-23, we observe that in most of the states, rural inflation is more than the urban inflation, unlike during the COVID period where urban inflation was more than the rural. Okay, and one more observation is 2020 to 23. The gap between rural and urban inflation have reduced. Gap between rural and urban inflation have reduced. That's all. This content, if you can remember and recollect and understand, we can solve many questions. We can solve many questions in inflation, or any general question that is coming up in the exam, we can easily handle it. Okay, so that is what we should understand. And there are some questions in UPSC prelims questions which are very simple, and we'll just go through it. Inflation generally goes against creditors or bond holders. Okay, so whenever there is inflation, creditors are going to get affected. So this is one question. So inflation benefits bond holders always. Okay, so inflation goes against bond holders. Okay, so why? Because suppose there is 100 rupees bond, 5 rupees interest is offered on the bond. 100 rupees bond, 5 rupees. That time in 5 rupees is the interest. Okay, that time inflation rate is 3%, but the inflation rate became 6, and still we are giving you same 5 rupees. Means somebody who has purchased this bond, who is a bond holder is a creditor or the bond holder is going to lose. So inflation benefits bond holders is wrong, and therefore inflation benefits debtors is right. Inflation will take away money from the creditor to the debtor. Okay, so simple question that was asked. Now here if you see, with reference to inflation in India, which of the following statements, okay, so is correct? Okay, so RBI has no role. It's wrong. RBI has a role to controlling inflation is responsibility of government of India only, wrong. Increased money circulation helps in control. This is wrong. Money supply increases, demand pull inflation. Okay, so this is the easy question again. So these are simple questions. As a general level of prices may be caused by. Okay, so one is increase in money supply, demand pull inflation. Decrease in aggregate level of output, decrease. Supply is coming down, then also inflation will increase. So for this, we should be knowing the demand supply graphs basically. So suppose this is the demand graph and simple way to understand, and this is the supply graph. Okay. If supply is decreasing, it means the new supply graphs will shift leftwards, and therefore the inflation or the price is going to increase. This is price and this is quantity demanded supplied. Okay, so if this is the graph, okay, so this is how the inflation is going to increase. So, and increase in effective demand, demand pull inflation. So all are okay. So like this, graphs need not be remembered, but it's only for understanding. Okay. Then next is which of the following is likely to be most inflation? The worst way of deficit financing is by minting money because you're injecting new money into the economy. So creating new money to finance some deficit, it is going to be highly risky. It will be inflationary. Okay, so one last question. Which of the following measures would result in an increase in money supply in the economy? So here what we have to understand is money supply should decrease, okay, for reducing inflation. Increase in money supply. The question says result in increase. Purchase of government securities from public by the central bank. Okay, you're buying securities means you're giving money. Money supply is increasing. Deposit of currency in commercial banks by the public. Borrowing by government from the central bank. Sale of government securities to the public by the central bank. See here, sale of securities. You're selling security means money supply. Selling security, money is moving away from the market. So money supply is decreasing. So this should go wrong. Okay. So borrowing. So here obviously the answer should be 1 and 3. Simple questions, basic logic. But I think this time there can be questions on CPI, WPI or urban, rural, reasons which were nicely discussed in the survey. Okay, I hope I have made your preparation easy, and this is our new theme. And if you like our video, please do subscribe, please do comment, and we'll be coming up with continuous videos now. Due to some health issues, we could not come up with videos in the last 1 week. And please do subscribe and please do share these videos to all the serious students. I wish you all the best. Signing off. Thank you.